It begins not with the tricolor fluttering triumphantly in foreign skies, but with silence. The kind of silence that follows an empire's last breath, the silence of an island outpost in the Pacific, or of an abandoned mission in the Sahel, where only wind and memory remain. At its height, France's colonial empire stretched across 5 continents, its ambition boundless, its colors vibrant on maps that charted more than geography, they mapped the dreams and delusions of power. But by the dawn of the 21st century, all that remained were fragments. 13 scattered territories, and the soft, enduring echo of the French tongue. How did this empire, at times the second largest on earth, shrink to a ghost of its former self? And why does its legacy still haunt the world today? This is not simply the story of territorial loss. It is the story of identity, ideology, and the confrontation between ambition and reality. The French Empire was not built in a day, nor did it collapse in a single moment. Its rise was slow, hesitant, and often chaotic. Its fall even more so bloody, protracted, and, in some corners of the globe, still incomplete. In the early 16th century, France stood poised for greatness. With a powerful army and flourishing economy, the kingdom was ready to claim its share of the riches promised by the newly discovered Americas. But while Spain and Portugal surged ahead, France stumbled. Giovanni da Verrazzano charted the North American coast in 1524, but established no colony. Jacques Cartier claimed the St. Lawrence River for France in 1534, naming the land New France, but his fortified settlement at Charlesbourg Royal collapsed within 2 years. Religious turmoil back home hampered colonial ambitions. In the mid-16th century, Protestant Huguenots fleeing Catholic persecution sought refuge in the New World. They built fragile outposts in Brazil and Florida, only to be destroyed by Catholic rivals Portuguese and Spanish alike. A dream of liberty turned into a series of massacres, and France turned inward, consumed by its own religious civil wars. Yet the colonial idea never fully vanished. With the arrival of the 17th century, France turned again to the oceans. It was not gold that lured them this time, but fur. New France, anchored at Quebec and expanding westward, became a trading empire. Alliances with Native American tribes allowed fur traders to journey deep into the continent. The French did not settle in overwhelming numbers, but they ventured far to the Great Lakes, down the Mississippi, claiming lands that would one day become Louisiana. At the same time, France planted its flags across the Caribbean. Guadeloupe, Martinique, Saint-Domingue, these were sugar islands, brutal and lucrative, built on slavery and sustained by the Atlantic trade. In Africa, they established coastal trading posts not for territory, but for people, enslaved people. The economy of empire was not only measured in spices or silver but in bodies. Asia too beckoned. The French founded enclaves in India, Pondicherry, and Chandernagore, among them, though these remained marginal in the shadow of the British Raj. And in the Pacific, explorers sketched the outlines of distant archipelagos, claiming New Caledonia, Tahiti, and more. By the end of the 17th century, France's first colonial empire stretched from the Arctic to the tropics. But it was brittle. Unlike the British, the French built their empire less on migration and more on trade and diplomacy. And so, when war came as it did in the form of the War of Spanish Succession and then the 7 Years' War, France found itself outmaneuvered. By 1763, France had lost nearly all of its North American holdings to Britain. Its Caribbean islands had been seized. Its influence in India had waned. The First Empire had collapsed. A cuisine that conquered palates far beyond Paris. And the tricolor flag that once fluttered from the heart of Africa to the jungles of Indochina. Yet today, when we think of France, we think of a nation bounded by rivers and coastlines, not one whose ambition once spanned continents. A language spoken in over 50 countries. The paradox is striking. How did a country that once commanded the second largest empire in the world become so confined? More than just a story of conquests and collapses, this is a tale of ambition, blood, betrayal, and of memory. A memory that still lingers in Creole dialects, in the shape of railroads cutting through tropical forests, in the names of cities and the borders drawn by colonizers long gone. But what truly happened to the French Empire? Why did it rise with such confidence and fall with such fragmentation? And why do its remnants still shape the political, cultural, and even emotional landscapes of our world today? Let's uncover the story not just of a colonial power, but of a nation that projected its soul across the globe, only to watch it fracture, fade, and echo back in unexpected ways. To understand the French colonial empire, we must begin not with conquest, but with hesitation. In the early 16th century, France was among Europe's strongest nations, militarily powerful, culturally resplendent, and economically competitive. The age of discovery had begun. Spain and Portugal had already divided the globe with the Treaty of Tordesillas. England was sending ships across the Atlantic. But France, despite its might, arrived late to the table. Why? Domestic instability was part of it. The French wars of religion tore the kingdom apart between 1562 and 1598, as Catholics and Protestants bled each other in fields and cities alike. Amid this internal chaos, the crown lacked the focus and resources to commit to overseas expansion. When expeditions were launched, such as Giovanni da Verrazzano's mapping of the North American coast in 1524, or Jacques Cartier's voyages to the St. Lawrence River in the 1530s, they yielded claims, but little substance. And yet, the dream persisted. Protestant leaders like Admiral Gaspard de Coligny envisioned the New World not just as a source of wealth, but as a refuge, a place where persecuted Huguenots might build communities free from Catholic domination. These hopes were met with tragedy. The French Florida colony at Fort Caroline was wiped out by the Spanish in 1565. France Antarctique, a colony in Brazil, was crushed by the Portuguese. Failure, it seemed, was becoming the empire's inheritance. But the 17th century brought a new rhythm. Under Cardinal Richelieu, France turned its eyes outward once more. Recognizing the commercial potential of fur, fish, and farmland, the monarchy began to fund and formalize colonization efforts. Quebec was founded in 1608 by Samuel de Champlain, and soon became the nerve center of Nouvelle France. Across the Caribbean, in islands like Guadeloupe, Martinique, and Saint-Domingue, sugar plantations sprouted, manned by enslaved Africans and governed by royal decree. In Africa, in India, in the Americas, France was finally building an empire. But behind every settlement, there was a contradiction. A tension between Enlightenment ideals and imperial realities, between freedom at home and domination abroad. The French Empire was never built on the British model. Where Britain exported families and institutions, France exported commerce, clergy, and bureaucracy. The French crown's ambitions were entwined with mercantilism, a belief that colonies should exist solely to enrich the motherland. This led to the formation of powerful chartered companies, the Company of the Indies, the Company of the 100 Associates. These weren't just trading entities. They were mini sovereignties, equipped to govern, tax, and even wage war in the king's name. But empires are not made by companies alone. They are also made by individuals, men driven by faith, greed, or glory. In North America, the coureurs de bois, rugged fur traders, pushed ever westward, establishing fragile alliances with indigenous nations. They were both ambassadors and opportunists, carving French influence through rivers and forests, more with barter than bullets. In the Caribbean, French planters reaped immense profits from sugar, rum, and indigo. But these riches came at a horrific cost. The Code Noir, issued by Louis XIV in 1685, codified the brutal enslavement of Africans in the colonies. It offered minimal protections while enshrining French Catholic supremacy and racial hierarchy. The colonies, though economically vital, became theaters of unimaginable cruelty. Then there were the missionaries. Jesuits, in particular, wielded immense power. In Canada, they baptized indigenous children and documented native languages. In Asia, they sought converts among emperors. Their zeal was genuine, but often clashed with colonial pragmatism, especially when commerce and conversion collided. As the empire expanded, so too did its enemies. Britain was the most relentless. The War of Spanish Succession, 1701, 1714. The War of Austrian Succession, 1740, 1748. And above all, the 7 Years' War, 1756, 1763, exposed the fragility of France's far-flung possessions. With each treaty signed, France bled territory. By the Treaty of Paris in 1763, it had lost Canada, much of India, and almost every Caribbean island not protected by divine luck or British oversight. It was a shattering moment. Voltaire would famously quip that France had lost a few acres of snow. But this dismissive line concealed a deeper wound, the realization that the French Empire, for all its grandeur, could not match Britain's naval reach or commercial dominance. Still, France would not give up its imperial ambitions. In fact, the Revolution and Napoleon would only transform them. The French Revolution exploded in 1789 with promises of liberté, égalité, fraternité. Yet, for the colonies, liberty proved elusive. In Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, enslaved people watched as revolutionaries in Paris debated rights and freedoms. They heard that the National Assembly had declared all men equal, but plantation masters held firm, and the chains remained. Then, in August 1791, the world turned upside down. Under the leadership of figures like Toussaint Louverture, the enslaved population launched a revolt. They torched plantations, overwhelmed militias, and upended the economy of the richest colony in the French Empire. What followed was not a mere rebellion, but a revolution, the only successful slave revolt in history. Haiti declared independence in 1804, dealing a catastrophic blow to French imperial prestige and pocketbooks. Napoleon, who had briefly seized back the colony in 1802, lost interest in the Americas entirely. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803, in which France sold vast territory to the United States for $15 million, was more than a financial maneuver. It was a retreat. Napoleon's focus would remain Europe. And yet, when the dust of Waterloo settled in 1815, a strange thing happened. France began to rebuild its empire, not in defiance of its revolutionary past, but as an extension of it. This was the Second French colonial empire. Its birth was marked not by fur trade or sugar, but by war. In 1830, France invaded Algeria. The campaign was brutal, a drawn-out conquest involving scorched earth tactics, mass expulsions, and the rise of settler colonialism. Over the next decades, Algeria would become a département, a formal extension of France itself. But to the Algerians, it was never truly France. It was occupation. From North Africa, the empire stretched outward. In West Africa, French administrators carved out a federation of colonies under Dakar's command. In equatorial Africa, rivers like the Congo were seized and mapped. In Indochina, France captured Saigon and built a colonial capital in Hanoi. In Madagascar, New Caledonia, Polynesia, and Lebanon French flags replaced local sovereignty. But what was the motive now? Commerce remained, so did the missionary impulse. But increasingly, the empire was justified as a civilizing mission, the mission civilisatrice. It was a doctrine that claimed France had a duty to bring its language, culture, and enlightenment to what it deemed lesser peoples. It was in many ways an illusion, noble-sounding, but deeply patronizing and often violently enforced. This was not just colonization, this was assimilation. And assimilation was no less destructive than domination. The empire operated through a complex web of administration. In some colonies, France ruled directly, imposing French law, currency, and education. In others, especially protectorates like Morocco or Tunisia, local rulers remained, but only as figureheads beneath the tricolor shadow. Colonial subjects were taught that to be French was to abandon their native languages, customs, and often their faiths. In Algeria, Berber and Arab identities were suppressed in schools. In West Africa, the elite were trained in French literature and law, producing a class of administrators more loyal to Paris than to their homelands. But the divide between citizen and subject was stark. Only a tiny fraction of colonial populations were granted full French citizenship, typically those who had assimilated entirely. Most were governed by the Code de l'indigène, a legal regime of racial hierarchy, forced labor, and collective punishment. Economically, the empire was extractive. Railroads were built not to connect communities, but to carry rubber, palm oil, and timber to ports. In Indochina, rice was exported while locals went hungry. In the Congo, entire villages were conscripted to tap latex. Culturally too, the project was paradoxical. French literature was taught in Dakar and Hanoi, but African and Asian history were not. The colonies were expected to absorb the culture of the metropole, even as they were denied equality within it. And yet the French Empire was not entirely monolithic. There were pockets of genuine intellectual exchange, especially among colonized elites, who would later challenge France on its own philosophical grounds. As one Vietnamese student wrote in 1930, "You taught us liberty, we will hold you to it." When the First World War broke out in 1914, France called on its empire. Over 600,000 colonial soldiers, tirailleurs, Senegalese, North African infantry, Indo-Chinese laborers, were sent to the trenches of the Western Front. They fought and died at the Marne, at Verdun, at the Somme. They were told they were fighting for civilization, for the defense of the Republic. But when the war ended, the promises faded. Few were granted citizenship. Fewer still were honored at home. Instead, they returned to find their villages taxed, their resources looted, and their voices silenced. Still, France's empire reached its peak in the post-war years, controlling over 5 million square miles of territory. The League of Nations even handed it new mandates, Syria and Lebanon, carved from the Ottoman corpse. But within the colonies, something had changed. The war had planted seeds of consciousness. Soldiers had seen Paris. They had fought beside men who called themselves equals, and they returned with questions. Why are we not equal? Why are we ruled, but not ruling? Why do we speak your language, die in your wars, and still remain outsiders? These questions would not be silenced for long. The Second World War shattered Europe, but it fractured the French Empire even more profoundly. When Germany conquered France in 1940, the colonies were split between loyalty to the Vichy regime and the Free French led by Charles de Gaulle. Across North and West Africa, in Syria, Lebanon, and beyond, colonial subjects were once again drafted into France's wars. They served with distinction, particularly in the Free French forces that fought in Italy, the Middle East, and later in the liberation of France itself. But the contradictions could no longer be hidden. Colonial soldiers, who had risked everything to defend liberty, returned to find the old structures of racial and political subjugation intact. They had marched under the banner of the Republic, but they had not become part of it. Tensions rose. In 1944, in Tiaroy, Senegal, dozens of demobilized West African soldiers were massacred by French troops for demanding back pay and fair treatment. It was a grim symbol of the post-war status quo, promises unfulfilled, justice denied. In response, nationalist movements began to gather strength across the empire. In Indochina, the Viet Minh under Ho Chi Minh declared independence in 1945, quoting directly from the American Declaration of Independence. France refused to recognize it. Instead, they returned with force, plunging Vietnam into a bloody 8-year war that ended in disaster for the French at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. In Algeria, a May 1945 demonstration in Sétif celebrating the end of the war turned into a massacre, with French forces killing as many as 45,000 people in reprisals. The message was clear. France would not give up its empire easily, but the tide was turning. The 1950s and 1960s were the decades of unmaking. France, like Britain, had emerged from the Second World War victorious but economically depleted. The cost of maintaining vast overseas territories in the face of growing armed resistance and mounting global criticism was becoming unsustainable. One by one, colonies began to fall away. In Indochina, the First Indochina War ended with the Geneva Accords in 1954. France withdrew, and the region was divided, setting the stage for the future Vietnam War between North and South. In North Africa, Tunisia and Morocco gained independence in 1956. But Algeria was different. With over 1 million French settlers, the Pieds Noirs Algeria was seen by many in France, not as a colony, but as part of France itself. The war that followed, from 1954 to 1962, was one of the most brutal in the history of decolonization. It involved torture, bombings, assassinations, and civil strife not just between Algerians and French troops, but within French society itself. In France, the Algerian War led to a political crisis so severe that it collapsed the Fourth Republic. Charles de Gaulle returned to power in 1958, founding the Fifth Republic and eventually, reluctantly, agreeing to Algerian independence. In July 1962, after more than 1 million deaths, Algeria became a sovereign nation. Elsewhere, in West and Central Africa, France took a different route, a peaceful, negotiated transition. Between 1958 and 1960, most of its sub-Saharan African colonies achieved independence. But the web of French influence was not entirely severed. Through a complex set of military agreements, currency unions, and intelligence networks, France maintained what came to be known as France-Afrique, a post-colonial sphere of influence that allowed it to project power and extract resources long after the formal end of empire. By the 1970s, the French Empire, as it had existed for centuries, was effectively gone. What remained were 13 overseas territories, including Martinique, Guadeloupe, French Guyana, Réunion, New Caledonia, and French Polynesia. These regions, scattered across oceans and continents, are legally part of France today, represented in the National Assembly, using the euro, protected by the French military. Yet tensions endure. In Mayotte, protests over immigration and inequality. In Martinique and Guadeloupe, struggles over economic exploitation and environmental poisoning. In New Caledonia, calls for independence have led to referendums, each one sharpening the divide between indigenous Kanak communities and French loyalists. The empire is gone, and yet not entirely. Its legacy is etched into laws, languages, and lives. French is spoken in Senegal, in Lebanon, in Haiti, in Vietnam. It is the language of diplomacy, of culture, of identity, for over 230 million people worldwide. But it is also the language of empire, taught in schools, where local languages were once forbidden, spoken in cities built with the labor of the colonized. And the physical reminders endure as well. Boulevards named for colonial generals, statues of explorers, museums filled with artifacts acquired by force or fraud. France continues to grapple with its colonial memory, with how to teach it, how to honor it, and how to heal from it. So what, in the end, was the French Empire? A network of power, trade, and violence? A civilizing mission, as it was claimed, or an illusion of benevolence that masked exploitation? A bridge between peoples or a wall that divided? The truth, as with all empires, lies somewhere in between. The French Empire spread literature and law, art and architecture. It also enforced obedience with guns and chains. It raised cathedrals and shattered families. It sent forth missionaries and deployed regiments. It was grandeur and ruin, ambition and arrogance, glory and grief, a contradiction that stretched across oceans and centuries. And though its borders no longer stretch from Quebec to Saigon, its consequences are not buried in the past. They live on in Paris suburbs and West African capitals, in Polynesian lagoons and Caribbean protests, in the words of poets and the wounds of memory. Empires fall, but their shadows remain. One of the deepest shadows cast by the French Empire is that which stretches over Southeast Asia, a region once drawn into the empire's orbit by the lure of trade and sustained by military power. Nowhere is the legacy more complex, more painful, than in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The First Indochina War ended in 1954, but its consequences did not. After the French withdrawal, Vietnam was divided between a communist north and a western-backed south. Laos and Cambodia followed their own fraught paths, but all three nations would be pulled into the vortex of Cold War conflict. The Americans, convinced that the loss of Indochina was a failure of will, sought to reverse history. They entered the war that France had started but could not finish, and repeated many of the same mistakes. For France, the defeat at Dien Bien Phu was more than a military loss. It was a psychological fracture, a moment when the myth of invincibility was broken. Veterans returned to a country that quickly turned the page. Politicians blamed one another. The dead were buried far from home, in jungles they'd never seen until war brought them there. And yet, even after independence, the French legacy lingered. In Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City, colonial villas line leafy boulevards. The French language remains in schools and universities. The coffee is brewed thick and sweet, a taste inherited from distant Marseille. Cambodia's royal court, Laos's administrative system, Vietnam's architecture, all bear the fingerprints of empire. But alongside these traces of culture are scars. The French waged brutal counterinsurgency campaigns. Villages were razed, torture became routine. The promise of liberty was offered and then withheld. The resentment planted in that soil would bloom during the Vietnam War, when anti-colonial fury met American hubris in a conflict that would scar generations. In 1995, France formally recognized the horrors of Dien Bien Phu. Veterans were honored, cemeteries restored. But no monument can fully encompass the grief of a war that was, at its heart, a betrayal of the very ideals France claimed to represent. While France's loss of Indochina was sudden and humiliating, its withdrawal from Africa was slower and more ambiguous. Between 1958 and 1960, most of France's colonies in sub-Saharan Africa achieved independence. But what followed was not a clean break. Unlike Britain, which often stepped back entirely, France maintained a dense network of influence. Through currency controls, military bases, intelligence operations, and development aid, Paris retained a hand in the affairs of its former colonies. This system, France-Afrique, was both overt and covert. Presidents from Gabon to Côte d'Ivoire received French military protection in exchange for loyalty and access to natural resources. Elites were educated in French universities, owned property in Paris, and received support from French banks and corporations. But the costs were high. Corrupt regimes flourished under French protection. Popular movements were suppressed. In some cases, like the 1960 assassination of Congo's Patrice Lumumba, carried out by Congolese rivals, but with complicity from Western powers, France's role remains murky, but undeniable. In Rwanda, France backed the Hutu-led government that would later perpetrate genocide in 1994, a support born of Cold War calculations, but one that has left deep scars and a lingering diplomatic rift. And yet, in other places, France did intervene to prevent civil war, to support peacekeeping, to provide humanitarian aid. Mali, Chad, and the Central African Republic have all seen French troops return not as conquerors, but as reluctant partners in fragile peace efforts. Far from the headlines, France's remaining overseas territories reveal yet another layer of imperial legacy. In the Caribbean, Martinique and Guadeloupe are fully part of France departments, with elected deputies, euro currency, and French schools. And yet, they are also places where unemployment runs high, where protests erupt against neglect, environmental disasters, and racial injustice. In 2021, protests swept the islands after revelations about chlorone, a pesticide banned in France in the 1970s, but used for decades on banana plantations in the Caribbean. The soil and water remain poisoned to this day. Trust, once fragile, has now eroded further. In South America, French Guiana is a paradox. It hosts the Kourou Space Center, a hub of European science and technology, but its surrounding towns struggle with poverty, overcrowded prisons, and chronic underfunding. In 2017, mass protests shut down roads and airports. The message was clear: if we are France, then treat us like it. In the Pacific, French Polynesia and New Caledonia sit atop coral atolls and mineral-rich lands. But beneath the turquoise waters and touristic gloss lies a long history of nuclear testing, land dispossession, and political tension. Between 1966 and 1996, France conducted nearly 200 nuclear tests in the South Pacific, many of them atmospheric, sending radioactive clouds drifting across the islands. Cancer rates soared. Compensation was slow and grudging. Trust never returned. In New Caledonia, the indigenous Kanak population continues to seek independence. Referendums in 2018, 2020, and 2021 showed a growing divide between pro-independence Kanaks and pro-France settlers. Each vote brought accusations of manipulation, boycott, and betrayal. France insists it offers equality, liberty, and fraternity to all its citizens. But the island territories raise a troubling question. Can a republic founded on universal values still bear the weight of colonial inequality? More than a century has passed since the French Empire stood at its height. Yet its ghosts still walk among us. They live in the statues that adorn Parisian plazas of generals who burned villages in Algeria and governors who ruled with decree. They whisper from the halls of the Louvre, where artifacts from Egypt, Cambodia, and Benin are displayed under vaulted ceilings. They speak in courtrooms where descendants of the colonized demand recognition for past crimes. In classrooms where history books still struggle to name colonization for what it was, conquest and control. In 2021, French President Emmanuel Macron acknowledged France's role in the Rwandan genocide, saying, "France has a role, a history, and a political responsibility." It was a start, but many asked, is that enough? For some, France must apologize more and return stolen artifacts, compensate victims, open archives. For others, that would be to dwell in the past. But the past is not gone. It is in the children of Algerian immigrants who face discrimination in the Paris suburbs, in the statues of Napoleon that still tower over town squares, in the pride and pain of speaking French in Mali, in Haiti, in Vietnam. Empires fall, but they leave behind a grammar of power, a vocabulary of inequality, a silence that echoes long after the last ship sails. And perhaps the final irony of the French Empire is this, that a nation which once sought to civilize the world now struggles to reconcile with what it taught, what it took, and what it left behind. The history of the French Empire is not just a litany of dates, conquests, and losses. It is a mirror cracked, tarnished, but unyielding in which France still sees itself. It is the story of a republic that professed liberty, but denied it to millions. Of a civilization that exported art, language, and architecture, and also exile, chains, and blood. It is a story of missionaries and merchants, of soldiers and slaves, of explorers with maps and empires built on silence. For some, the legacy is pride. For others, it is trauma. And for most, it is something in between. A history not fully reckoned with, not fully understood, not fully over. The map of France today stretches beyond Europe, not because of conquest, but because of what was never truly dismantled. What remains is not an empire, but an afterimage. Not dominion, but dependency. Not rule, but residue. In schools from Cayenne to Noumea, in the ballots of New Caledonia, in the protests of Guadeloupe, in the ruins of St. Louis, and in the haunted silence of Sétif, the French Empire is not past. It is present. The question now is not whether to forget. The question is what kind of future can be built upon a foundation that still trembles with unspoken truths. In that silence, perhaps, there is one final lesson of empire, that history is never truly conquered, only remembered or ignored. If you value stories like this not just of nations, but of the people history leaves behind, subscribe to Legacy Files. Because the past isn't past. It's waiting to be heard. Today, African youth increasingly challenge the old paternalistic ties. In the streets of Bamako, Dakar, and Libreville, protests erupt against France's military presence, against the CFA franc currency, against the enduring inequality of the post-colonial order. But it's not just anger, there's also ambivalence. France is still a gateway to the world. The language, for many, is a tool of mobility. Scholarships to French universities remain coveted. And in literature, cinema, and music, African voices are reshaping what it means to be francophone, transforming the language of empire into a language of resistance, of identity, of pride.